Chapter 15. Something He Shouldn't Have Done. For several weeks the rain was on and off and on and off, and Bruno and Schmoll did not see as much of each other as they would have liked. When they did meet, Bruno found that he was starting to worry about his friend, because he seemed to be getting even thinner by the day, and his face was growing more and more gray. Sometimes he brought more bread and cheese with him to give to Schmoll, and from time to time he even managed to hide a piece of chocolate cake in his pocket. But the walk from the house to the place in the fence where the two boys met was a long one, and sometimes Bruno got hungry on the way, and found that one bite of the cake would lead to another, and that in turn led to another, and by the time there was only one mouthful left, he knew it would be wrong to give that to Schmoll, because it would only tease his appetite and not satisfy it. Father's birthday was coming up soon, and although he didn't want a fuss, Mother arranged a party for all the officers serving it out with, and a great fuss was made to prepare for it. Every time she sat down to make more plans for the party, Lieutenant Cutler was there beside her to help. Between them they seemed to make more lists and than could ever possibly be needed. Bruno decided to make a list of his own, a list of all the reasons why he didn't like Lieutenant Cutler. There was the fact that he never smiled, and always looked as if he was trying to find somebody to cut out of his will. On the rare occasion when he spoke to Bruno, he addressed him as "little man," which was just plain nasty because, as Mother pointed out, he just hadn't had his growth spurt yet. Not to mention the fact that he was always in the living room with Mother and making jokes with her, and Mother laughed at his jokes more than she laughed at Father's. Once, when Bruno was watching the camp from his bedroom window, he saw a dog approach the fence and start barking loudly, and when Lieutenant Cutler heard it, he marched right over to the dog and shot it. Then there was all that nonsense that Gretel came out with whenever he was around. And Bruno still hadn't forgotten the evening with Pavel, the waiter, who was really a doctor, and how angry the young lieutenant had been. Also, whenever Father was called away to Berlin on an overnight trip, the lieutenant hung around the house as if he were in charge. He would be there when Bruno was going to bed and be back again in the morning before he even woke up. There were a lot more reasons why Bruno didn't like Lieutenant Cutler, but these were the first things that came into his mind. On the afternoon before the birthday party, Bruno was in his room with the door open when he heard Lieutenant Cutler arriving at the house and speaking to someone, although he couldn't hear anyone answer back. A few minutes later, he was coming downstairs. As he was coming downstairs, he heard Mother giving instructions about what needed to be done, and Lieutenant Cutler saying, "Don't worry, this one knows which side his bread is buttered on," and then laughing in a nasty way. Bruno walked towards the living room with a new book Father had given him called Treasure Island, intending to sit in there for an hour or two while he read it. But as he walked through the hallway he ran into Lieutenant Cutler, who was just leaving the kitchen. "Hello, little man," the soldier said, sneering at him as usual. "Hello," said Bruno, frowning. "What are you up to, then?" Bruno stared at him, thinking of even more reasons to dislike him. "I'm going in there to read my book," he said, pointing towards the living room. Without a word, Cutler whipped the book out of Bruno's hands and started to flick through it. "Treasure Island," he said. "What's it about, then?" "Well, there's an island," said Bruno slowly, to make sure that the soldier could keep up. "And there's a treasure on it." "I could have guessed that," said Cutler, looking at him as if there were things he would do to the boy if he were a son of his and not the son of the commandant. "Tell me something I don't know about it." "There's a pirate in it," said Bruno, "called Long John Silver, and a boy called Jim Hawkins." "An English boy?" asked Cutler. "Yes," said Bruno. "Grunt," grunted Cutler. Bruno stared at him and wondered how long it would be before he gave back his book. He didn't seem particularly interested in it, but when Bruno reached for it, he pulled it away. "Sorry," he said, holding it out again, and when Bruno reached for it, he pulled it away for the second time. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he repeated, and held it out once more, and this time Bruno swiped it out of his hands quicker than he could pull it away. "Aren't you quick?" muttered Lieutenant Cutler between his teeth. Bruno tried to step past him, but for some reason Lieutenant Cutler seemed to want to talk to him today. "All set for the party, are we?" he asked. "Well, I am," said Bruno, who had been spending more time with Gretel lately and had developed a liking for sarcasm. "I can't speak for you." "There will be a lot of people here," said Lieutenant Cutler, breathing in heavily and looking around, as if this were his house and not Bruno's. "We'll be on our best behavior, won't we?" "Well, I'll be," said Bruno. "I can't speak for you." "You've a lot to say for such a little man," said Lieutenant Cutler. Bruno narrowed his eyes and wished he were taller, stronger, and 8 years older. A ball of anger exploded inside of him and made him wish that he had the courage to say exactly what he wanted to say. It was one thing he decided to be told what to do by Mother and Father. That was perfectly reasonable and to be expected. But it was another thing entirely to be told what to do by someone else, even by someone with a fancy title like Lieutenant. "Oh, Kurt, precious, you're still here," said Mother, stepping out of the kitchen and coming towards them. "I have a little free time now if—" "Oh!" she said, noticing Bruno standing there. "Bruno, what are you doing here?" "I was going into the living room to read my book," said Bruno, "or I was trying to, at least." "Well, run along into the kitchen for a moment," she said. "I need a private word with Lieutenant Cutler." And they stepped into the living room together as Lieutenant Cutler closed the door in Bruno's face. Seething with anger, Bruno went into the kitchen and got the biggest surprise of his life. There, sitting at a table a long way from the other side of the fence, was Shmuel. Bruno could barely believe his eyes. "Shmuel!" he said. "What are you doing here?" Shmuel looked up, and his terrified face broke into a broad smile when he saw his friend standing there. "Bruno!" he said. "What are you doing here?" repeated Bruno, for although he still didn't quite understand what took place on the other side of the fence, there was something about the people from there that made him think they shouldn't be here in his house. "He brought me here," said Shmuel. "He?" asked Bruno. "You don't mean Lieutenant Cutler?" "Yes, he said there was a job for me to do here." And when Bruno looked down he saw 64 small glasses, the ones Mother used when she was having one of her medicinal sherries, sitting on the kitchen table, and beside them on a bowl of warm soapy water, and lots of paper napkins. "What on earth are you doing?" asked Bruno. "They asked me to polish the glasses," said Shmuel. "They said they needed someone with tiny fingers." As if to prove something that Bruno already knew, he held his hand out, and Bruno couldn't help but notice that it was like the hand of a pretend skeleton that Herr Litz had brought with him one day, when they were studying human anatomy. "I'd never noticed before," he said in a disbelieving voice, almost to himself. "Never noticed what?" asked Shmuel. In reply, Bruno held his own hand out, so that the tips of their middle fingers were almost touching. "Our hands," he said. "They're so different. Look." The two boys looked down at the same time, and the difference was easy to see. Although Bruno was small for his age, and certainly not fat, his hand appeared healthy and full of life. The veins weren't visible through the skin. The fingers weren't little more than dying twigs. Shmuel's hand, however, told a very different story. "How did it get like that?" he asked. "I don't know," said Shmuel. "It used to look more like yours, but I didn't notice it changing. Everyone on my side of the fence looks like this now." Bruno frowned. He thought about the people in their striped pajamas and wondered what was going on at Outwith, and whether it wasn't a very bad idea if it made people look so unhealthy. None of it made any sense to Bruno. None of it made any sense to him. Not wanting to look at Shmuel's hand any longer, Bruno turned round and opened the refrigerator, rooting about inside it for something to eat. There was half a stuffed chicken left from over from lunchtime. Bruno's eyes sparkled in delight, for there were very few things in life that he enjoyed more than cold chicken with sage and onion stuffing. He took a knife from the drawer and cut himself a few healthy slices and coated them with stuffing before turning back to his friend. "I'm very glad you're here," he said, speaking with his mouth full. "If only you didn't have to polish glasses, I could show you my room." He told me not to move from the seat, or there'd be trouble." "I wouldn't mind him," said Bruno, trying to sound braver than he really was. "This isn't his house. It's mine, and when Father's away, I'm in charge." "Can you believe he's never even read Treasure Island?" Shmuel looked as if he wasn't really listening. Instead, his eyes were focused on the slices of chicken and stuffing that Bruno was throwing casually into his mouth. After a moment, Bruno realized what he was looking at, and immediately felt guilty. "I'm sorry, Shmuel," he said quickly. "I should have given you some chicken, too. Are you hungry?" "That's a question you never have to ask me," said Shmuel, who, although he had never met Gretel in his life, knew something about sarcasm, too. "Wait there, I'll cut some off for you." Bruno opened the fridge and Bruno, opening the fridge and cutting another 3 healthy slices. "No, if he comes back," said Shmuel, shaking his head quickly and looking back and forth towards the door. "Who comes back?" "You don't mean Lieutenant Cutler? I'm just supposed to be cleaning the glasses," he said, looking at the bowl of water in front of him in despair, and then looking back at the slices of chicken that Bruno held out to him. "He's not going to mind," said Bruno, who was confused by how anxious Shmuel seemed. "It's only food." "I can't," said Shmuel, shaking his head and looking as if he was going to cry. "He'll come back. I know he will," he continued, his sentences running quickly together. "I should have eaten them when you offered them. Now it's too late. If I take them, he'll come in and—" "Shmuel, here," said Bruno, stepping forward and putting the slices in his friend's hand. "Just eat them. There's lots left for our tea. You don't have to worry about that." The boy stared at the food in his hand for a moment, and then looked up at Bruno with wide and grateful but terrified eyes. He threw one more glance in the direction of the door, and seemed to make a decision, because he thrust all 3 pieces into his mouth at once, in one go, and gobbled them down in 20 seconds flat. "Well, you don't have to eat them so quickly," said Bruno. "You'll make yourself sick." "I don't care," said Shmuel, giving a faint smile. "Thank you, Bruno." Bruno smiled back, and he was about to offer him some more food, but just at that moment Lieutenant Cutler reappeared in the kitchen, and stopped when he saw the 2 boys talking. Bruno stared at him, feeling the atmosphere grow heavy, sensing Shmuel's shoulders sinking down as he reached for another glass, and began polishing, ignoring Bruno. Lieutenant Cutler marched over to Shmuel and glared at him. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Didn't I tell you to polish those glasses?" Shmuel nodded his head quickly and started to tremble a little as he picked up another napkin and dipped it into the water. "Who told you you were allowed to talk in this house?" continued Cutler. "Do you dare to disobey me?" "Oh, sir," said Shmuel quietly. "I'm sorry, sir." He looked up at Lieutenant Cutler, who frowned, leaning forward slightly and tilting his head as he examined the boy's face. "Have you been eating?" he asked him in a quiet voice, as if he could scarcely believe himself. Shmuel shook his head. "You have been eating," insisted Lieutenant Cutler. "Did you steal something from that fridge?" Shmuel opened his mouth and closed it. He opened it again and tried to find the words, but there were none. He looked towards Bruno, his eyes pleading for help. "Answer me!" shouted Lieutenant Cutler. "Did you steal something from that fridge?" "No, sir. He gave it to me," said Shmuel, tears welling up in his eyes as he threw a sideways glance at Bruno. "He's my friend," he added. "Your—" began Lieutenant Cutler, looking across at Bruno in confusion. He hesitated. "What do you mean, he's your friend?" he asked. "Do you know this boy, Bruno?" Bruno's mouth dropped open, and he tried to remember the way you used your mouth if you wanted to say the words yes. He'd never seen anyone look so terrified as Shmuel did at that moment, and he wanted to say the right things to make things better. But then he realized that he couldn't, because he was feeling just as terrified himself. "Do you know this boy?" repeated Cutler. "Do you know this boy?" repeated Cutler, in a louder voice. "Have you been talking to the prisoners?" He was here when I came in," said Bruno. "He was cleaning glasses." "That's not what I asked you," said Cutler. "Have you seen him before? Have you talked to him? Why does he say you're his friend?" Bruno wished he could run away. He hated Lieutenant Cutler, but he was advancing on him now, and all Bruno could think of was the afternoon when he had seen him shooting a dog, and the evening when Pavel had made him so angry, and he— "Tell me, Bruno!" shouted Cutler, his face growing red. "I won't ask you a 3rd time." "I've never spoken to him," said Bruno immediately. "I've never seen him before in my life. I don't know him." Lieutenant Cutler nodded and seemed satisfied with the answer. Very slowly he turned his head to look at Schmuel, who wasn't crying any more, merely staring at the floor and looking as if he was trying to convince his soul not to live inside his tiny body any more, but to slip away and sail to the door and rise up into the sky, gliding through the clouds until it was very far away. "You will finish polishing all these glasses," said Lieutenant Cutler in a very quiet voice now, so quiet that Bruno almost couldn't hear him. It was as if his anger had just changed into something else. Not quite the opposite, but something unexpected and dreadful. "And then I will come to collect you and bring you back to camp, where we will have a discussion about what happens to boys who steal. This is understood, yes?" Schmuel nodded and picked up another napkin and started to polish another glass. Bruno watched as his fingers shook and knew that he was terrified of breaking one. His heart sank, but as much as he wanted to, he couldn't look away. "Come on, little man," said Lieutenant Cutler, coming towards Bruno now, and putting an unfriendly arm around his shoulders. "You go to the living room and read your book, and leave this little to finish his work." He used the same word he'd used to Pavel when he had sent him to find the tire. Bruno nodded and turned round and left the kitchen without looking back. His stomach churned inside him, and he thought for a moment that he was going to be sick. He had never felt so ashamed in his life. He had never imagined that he could behave so cruelly. He wondered how a boy who thought he was a good person really could act in such a cowardly way towards a friend. He sat in the living room for several hours, but couldn't concentrate on his book, and didn't dare go back in the kitchen until later that evening, when Lieutenant Cutler had already come back and collected Schmuel and taken him away. Every afternoon that followed, Bruno returned to the place in the fence where they met, but Schmuel was never there. After almost a week, he was convinced that what he had done was so terrible that he would never be forgiven. But on the 7th day, he was delighted to see that Schmuel was waiting for him, sitting cross-legged on the ground as usual, and staring at the dust beneath him. "Schmuel," he said, running towards him and sitting down, almost crying with relief and regret. "I'm so sorry, Schmuel. I don't know why I did it. Say you'll forgive me." "It's all right," said Schmuel, looking up at him now. There was a lot of bruising on his face, and Bruno grimaced for a moment. He forgot about his apology. "What happened to you?" he asked, and then didn't wait for an answer. "Was it your bicycle? Because that happened to me back in Berlin a couple of years ago. I fell off when I was going too fast, and was black and blue for weeks. Does it hurt?" "I don't feel it anymore," said Schmuel. "It looks like it hurts." "I don't feel anything anymore," said Schmuel. "Well, I am sorry about last week," said Bruno. "I hate that Lieutenant Cutler. He thinks he's in charge, but he isn't." He hesitated for a moment, not wanting to get sidetracked. He felt that he should say it one last time and really mean it. "I'm very sorry, Schmuel," he said in a clear voice. "I can't believe I didn't tell him the truth. I've never let a friend down like that before, Schmuel. I'm ashamed of myself." And when he said that, Schmuel smiled and nodded, and Bruno knew that he was forgiven. And then Schmuel did something that he had never done before. He lifted the bottom of the fence up like he did whenever Bruno brought him food, but this time he reached his hand out and held it there, waiting until Bruno did the same. And then the two boys shook hands and smiled at each other. It was the first time they had ever touched. Chapter 16. The Haircut. It had been almost a year since Bruno had come home to find Maria packing his things, and his memories of the life in Berlin had almost all faded away. When he thought back, he could remember that Carl and Martin were two of his three best friends for life. But try as he might, he couldn't remember who the other one was. And then something happened that meant that for 2 days he could leave out with and return to his old house. Grandmother died, and the family had to go home for the funeral. While he was there, Bruno realized he wasn't quite as small as he had been when he left, because he could see over things that he couldn't see over before. and when they stayed in their old house he could look through the window on the top floor and see across Berlin without having to stand on tiptoes. Bruno hadn't seen his grandmother since leaving Berlin, but he had thought about her every day. The things he remembered most about her were the productions that she and Gretel performed at Christmas and birthdays, and how she always had the perfect costume to suit whatever role he played. When he thought that they would never be able to do that again, it made him very sad indeed. The 2 days they spent in Berlin were also very sad ones. There was the funeral, and Bruno and Gretel and Father and Mother and Grandfather sat in the front row. Father was wearing his most impressive uniform, the starched and pressed one with the decorations. Father was particularly sad. Mother told Bruno because he had fought with Grandmother, and they hadn't made up before she died. There were lots of wreaths delivered to the church, and Father was proud of the fact that one of them had been sent by the Fury. But when Mother heard, she said that Grandmother would turn in her grave if she knew it was there. Bruno felt almost glad when they returned to Outwith. The house there had become his home now, and he'd stopped worrying about the fact that it only had 3 floors rather than 5, and it didn't bother him so much that came and went as if they owned the place. It slowly dawned on him that things weren't too bad there after all, especially since he had met Shmuel. He knew that there were many things he should be happy about, like the fact that Father and Mother seemed cheerful all the time now, and Mother didn't have to take as many of her afternoon naps or medicinal sherries, and Gretel was going through a phase, Mother's words, and tended to keep out of his way. There was also the fact that Lieutenant Kotler had been transferred away from Outwith and wasn't around to make Bruno feel angry and upset all the time. His departure had come about very suddenly, and there had been a lot of shouting between Father and Mother about it late at night. But he was gone, that was for sure, and he wasn't coming back. Gretel was inconsolable. That was something else to be happy about. No one called him little man any more. But the best thing was that he had a friend called Shmuel. He enjoyed walking along the fence every afternoon, and was pleased to see that his friend seemed a lot happier these days, and his eyes didn't seem so sunken, although his body was still ridiculously skinny, and his face unpleasantly gray. One day, while sitting opposite him at the usual place, Bruno remarked, "This is the strangest friendship I've ever had." "Why?" asked Shmuel. "Because every other boy I've ever been friends with has been someone that I've been able to play with," he replied. "And we never get to play together. All we get to do is sit here and talk." "I like sitting here and talking," said Shmuel. "Well, I do too, of course," said Bruno. "But it's a pity we can't do something more exciting from time to time. A bit of exploring, perhaps, or a game of football. We've never even seen each other without all this wire fencing in the way." Bruno often made comments like this because he wanted to pretend that the incident a few months earlier when he had denied his friendship with Shmuel had never taken place. It still preyed on his mind and made him feel bad about himself, although Shmuel, to his credit, seemed to have forgotten all about it. "Maybe some day we will," said Shmuel, "if they ever let us out." Bruno started to think more and more about the 2 sides of the fence and the reason it was there in the first place. He considered speaking to Father and Mother about it, but suspected that they would either be angry with him for mentioning it or tell him something unpleasant about Shmuel and his family. So instead he did something quite unusual. He decided to talk to the hopeless case. Gretel's room had changed quite considerably since the last time he had been there. For one thing, there wasn't a single doll in sight. One afternoon, a month or so earlier, around the time that Lieutenant Kotler had left Outwith, Gretel had decided that she didn't like dolls any more, and put them all in 4 large bags and thrown them away. In their place she had hung up maps of Europe that Father had given her, and every day she put little pins into them and moved the pins around constantly after consulting the daily newspaper. Bruno thought she might be going mad. But still, she didn't tease him or bully him as much as she used to, so he thought there could be no harm in talking to her. "Hello," he said, knocking politely on her door, because he knew how angry she always got if he just went in. "What do you want?" asked Gretel, who was sitting at her dressing table, experimenting with her hair. "Nothing," said Bruno. "Then go away." Bruno nodded, but came inside anyway, and sat down on the side of the bed. Gretel watched him from out of the side of her eyes, but didn't say anything. "Gretel," he said finally, "can I ask you something?" "If you make it quick," she said. "Everything here at Outwith," he began, but she interrupted him immediately. "It's not called Out with, Bruno," she said angrily, as if this was the worst mistake anyone had ever made in the history of the world. "Why can't you pronounce it right?" "It is called Outwith," he protested. "It's not," she insisted, pronouncing the name of the camp correctly for him. Bruno frowned and shrugged his shoulders at the same time. "But that's what I said," he said. "No, it's not." "Anyway, I'm not going to argue with you," said Gretel, losing her patience already, for she had very little of it to begin with. "What is it, anyway? What do you want to know?" "I want to know about the fence," he said firmly, deciding that this was the most important thing to begin with. "I want to know why it's there." Gretel turned round in her chair and looked at him curiously. "You mean you don't know?" she asked. "No," said Bruno. "I don't understand why we're not allowed on the other side of it. What's so wrong with us that we can't go over there and play?" Gretel stared at him and then suddenly started laughing, only stopping when she saw that Bruno was being perfectly serious. "Bruno!" she said in a childish voice, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "The fence isn't there to stop us from going over there. It's to stop them from coming over here." Bruno considered this, but it didn't make things clearer. "But why?" he asked. "Because they have to be kept together," explained Gretel. "With their families, you mean?" "Well, yes, with their families, but with their own kind, too." "What do you mean, their own kind?" Gretel sighed and shook her head. "With the other Jews, Bruno. Didn't you know that? That's why they have to be kept together. They can't mix with us." "Jews," said Bruno, testing the word out. He quite liked the way it sounded. "Jews," he repeated. "All the people over that side of the fence are Jews?" "Yes, that's right," said Gretel. "Are we Jews?" Gretel opened her mouth wide, as if she had been slapped in the face. "No, Bruno," she said. "No, we most certainly are not, and you shouldn't even say something like that." "But why not? What are we, then?" "We're—" began Gretel, but then she had to stop and think about it. "We're—" she repeated, but she wasn't quite sure what the answer to this question really was. "Well, we're not Jews," she said finally. "I know we're not," said Bruno in frustration. "I'm asking you, if we're not Jews, what are we instead?" "We're the opposite," said Gretel, answering quickly, and sounding a lot more satisfied with this answer. "Yes, that's it. We're the opposite." "All right," said Bruno, pleased that he had settled it in his head at last. "And the opposite live on this side of the fence, and the Jews live on that." "That's right, Bruno." "Don't the Jews like the opposite, then?" "No, it's us who don't like them, stupid." Bruno frowned. Gretel had been told time and time again that she wasn't allowed to call him stupid, but she still persisted with it. "Well, why don't we like them?" he asked. "Because they're Jews," said Gretel. "I see. And the opposite and the Jews don't get along." "No, Bruno," said Gretel. But she said this slowly because she had discovered something unusual in her hair and was examining it carefully. "Well, can't someone just get them together and—" Bruno was interrupted by the sound of Gretel breaking into a piercing scream. One that woke Mother up from her afternoon nap and brought her running into the room to find out which of her children had murdered the other one. While experimenting with her hair, Gretel had found a tiny egg, no bigger than the top of a pin. She showed it to Mother, who looked through her hair, pulling strands of it apart quickly, before marching over to Bruno and doing the same thing to him. "Oh, I don't believe it," said Mother angrily. "I knew something like this would happen in a place like this." It turned out that both Gretel and Bruno had lice in their hair, and Gretel had to be treated with a special shampoo that smelled horrible, and afterwards she sat in her room for hours on end, crying her eyes out. Bruno had the shampoo as well, but then Father decided that the best thing was for him to start afresh, and he got a razor and shaved all Bruno's hair off, which made Bruno cry. It didn't take long, and he hated seeing all his hair float down from his head and land on the floor at his feet. But Father said it had to be done. Afterwards, Bruno looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, and he felt sick. His entire head looked misshapen now that he was bald, and his eyes looked too big for his face. He was almost scared of his reflection. "Don't worry," Father reassured him. "It'll grow back. It'll only take a few weeks." "It's the filth around here that did it," said Mother. "If some people could only see the effect this place is having on all of us." When he saw himself in the mirror, Bruno couldn't help but think how much like Schmoll he looked now, and he wondered whether all the people on that side of the fence had lice as well, and that was why all their heads were shaved too. When he saw his friend the next day, Schmoll started to laugh at Bruno's appearance, which didn't do a lot for his dwindling self-confidence. "I look just like you now," said Bruno sadly, as if it was a terrible thing to admit. "Only fatter," admitted Schmoll. Chapter 17. Mother Gets Her Own Way. Over the course of the next few weeks, Mother seemed increasingly unhappy with life at Outwith, and Bruno understood perfectly well why that might be. After all, when they had first arrived, he had hated it, due to the fact that it was nothing like home, and lacked things such as 3 best friends for life. But that had changed for him over time, mostly due to Schmoll, who had become more important to him than Carl, Daniel, or Martin had ever been. But Mother didn't have a Schmoll of her own. There was no one for her to talk to, and the only person who she had been remotely friendly with, the young Lieutenant Cutler, had been transferred somewhere else. Although he tried not to be one of those boys who spends his time listening at keyholes and down chimneys, Bruno was passing by Father's office one afternoon while Mother and Father were inside having one of their conversations. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were talking quite loudly, and he couldn't help but overhear. "It's horrible," Mother was saying. "Just horrible. I can't stand it any more." "We don't have any choice," said Father. "This is our assignment, and—" "No, this is your assignment," said Mother. "Your assignment, not ours. You stay if you want to." "And what will people think," asked Father, "if I permit you and the children to return to Berlin without me? They will ask questions about my commitment to the work here." "Work!" shouted Mother. "You call this work?" Bruno didn't hear much more, because the voices were getting closer to the door, and there was always a chance that Mother would come storming out in search of a medicinal sherry, so he ran back upstairs instead. Still, he had heard enough to know that there was a chance they might be returning to Berlin, and to his surprise, he didn't know how to feel about that. There was one part of him that remembered that he loved his own life back there. So many things would have changed by now. Carl and the other 2 best friends, whose names he couldn't remember, would probably have forgotten him by now. Grandmother was dead, and they almost never heard from Grandfather, who Father had said had gone senile. But on the other hand, he had grown used to life at Outwith. He didn't mind Herr Litz. He'd become much friendlier with Maria than he ever had been back in Berlin. Gretel was still going through a phase and keeping out of his way, and she didn't seem to be quite so much of a hopeless case anymore. And his afternoon conversations with Schmoll filled him with happiness. Bruno didn't know how to feel, and decided that whatever happened, he would accept the decision without complaint. Nothing at all changed for a few weeks. Life went on as normal. Father spent most of his time either in his office or on the other side of the fence. Mother kept very quiet during the day, and was having an awful lot more of her afternoon naps. Some of them not even in the afternoon, but after lunch. And Bruno was worried for her health, because he had never known anyone to need quite so many medicinal sherries. Gretel stayed in her room, concentrating on the various maps she had pasted on the walls and consulting the newspapers for hours at a time before moving the pens around a little. Herr Litz was particularly pleased with her for doing this. And Bruno did exactly what was asked of him, and caused no chaos at all, and enjoyed the fact that he had one secret friend whom no one knew about. Then one day Father summoned Bruno and Gretel into his office and informed them of the changes that were to come. "Sit down, children," he said, indicating the two large leather armchairs that were usually told not to sit in when they had occasion to visit Father's office because of their grubby mitts. Father sat down behind his desk. "We've decided to make a few changes," he continued, looking a little sad as he spoke. "Tell me this. Are you happy here?" "Yes, Father, of course," said Gretel. "Certainly, Father," said Bruno. "And you don't miss Berlin at all?" The children paused for a moment and glanced at each other, wondering which of them was going to commit to an answer. "Well, I miss it terribly," said Gretel eventually. "I wouldn't mind having some friends again." Bruno smiled, thinking about his secret. "Friends," said Father, nodding his head. "Yes, I've often thought of that. It must have been lonely for you at times." "Very lonely," said Gretel in a determined voice. "And you, Bruno?" asked Father, looking at him now. "Do you miss your friends?" "Well, yes," he replied, considering his answer carefully. "But I think I'd miss people no matter where I went." That was an indirect reference to Shmuel, but he didn't want to make it any more explicit than that. "But would you like to go back to Berlin?" asked Father, "if the chance was there." "All of us?" asked Bruno. Father gave a deep sigh and shook his head. "Mother and Gretel and you, back to our old house in Berlin. Would you like that?" Bruno thought about it. "Well, I wouldn't like it if you weren't there," he said, because that was the truth. "So you'd prefer to stay here with me?" "I'd prefer all four of us to stay together," he said reluctantly, including Gretel in that, whether that was in Berlin or Outlet. "Oh, Bruno," said Gretel in an exasperated voice, and he didn't know whether that was because he might be spoiling the plans for their return, or because, according to her, he continued to mispronounce the name of their home. "Well, for the moment I'm afraid that's going to be impossible," said Father. "I'm afraid that the Fury will not relieve me of my command just yet. Mother, on the other hand, thinks this would be a good time for the three of you to return home and reopen the house. And when I think about it—" He paused for a moment and looked out of the window to his left, the window that led off to a view of the camp and the other side of the fence. "When I think about it, perhaps she's right. Perhaps this is not a place for children." "There are hundreds of children here," said Bruno, without really thinking about his words before saying them. "Only they're on the other side of the fence." A silence followed this remark, but it wasn't like a normal silence, where it just happens that no one is talking. It was like a silence that was very noisy. Father and Gretel stared at him, and he blinked in surprise. "What do you mean there are hundreds of children over there?" asked Father. "What do you know of what goes on over there?" Bruno opened his mouth to speak, but worried that he would get himself into trouble if he revealed too much. "I can see them from my bedroom window," he said finally. "They're very far away, of course, but it looks like there are hundreds, all wearing the striped pajamas." "The striped pajamas. Yes," said Father, nodding his head. "And you've been watching them, have you?" "Well, I've seen them," said Bruno. "I'm not sure if that's the same thing." Father smiled. "Very good, Bruno," he said. "And you're right, it's not quite the same thing." He hesitated again and then nodded his head, as if he had made a final decision. "No, she's right," he said, speaking out loud, but not looking at either Gretel or Bruno. "She's absolutely right. You've been here long enough as it is. It's time for you to go home." And so the decision was made. Word was sent ahead, and the house should be cleaned, the windows washed, the banisters varnished, the linens pressed, the beds made, and Father announced that Mother, Gretel, and Bruno would be returning to Berlin within the week. Bruno found that he was not looking forward to this as much as he would have expected, and he dreaded having to tell Shmuel the news.